Who do you think is the most important person of the 20th century? And here's another question. Who do you think is the greatest actor of the 20th century? Maybe they're the same person. Well, we're going to find out what my two guests think about that question. I'm Bruce Apar, and you're watching Frank Talks with Bruce the Blog. Well, actually, on the opening, I should have said what my two guests think about those two questions, which there was more than one question. And if you were paying attention to the opening credits, there was a little, or maybe it was a big hint that was there, but we'll confirm their answer in a couple of minutes. Frank Talks with Bruce the Blog is brought to you by Chase Media Group, publisher of The Penny Saver, and provider of multimedia marketing solutions for an omni-channel marketplace. And I'd like to remind everybody that in addition to watching Frank Talks with Bruce the Blog on Cablevision, you can also go to YouTube and search for Townlink TV or search for Bruce the Blog, and you'll be able to see any or all of the previous shows come up on the screen. And when I say all, some people these days are into binge viewing, so I just want to make sure that you can watch all. I don't even know how many episodes, and I should. It's probably well over 100. And so I'm very happy to have my two guests on a very interesting topic, and really it's a very interesting person, and there's a lot of different topics we're going to talk about. And so let me first introduce, and before I do that, I'm going to thank our CEO at Chase Media Group, Carla Chase, and our Chief Strategy Officer, Frank J. Rich, for bringing us to you every week. So let me introduce my guests, M.H. Freiberg and Stefan Lantz, who are, I would call you FDR files, I guess, right? That's one way to describe both of you, FDR files, because I've gotten to know these two gentlemen very recently, and I can tell you I've learned things in the past 24 hours even about FDR that I never knew. And so we're going to share some of that very fascinating and historic and historical information with you on the show. So MH, we really haven't talked about this, but I wanted to ask you, how did you come to your expertise really on Franklin D. Roosevelt?
Well, growing up, I'd always been a huge Roosevelt fan. Even as a teenager, I knew how important he was. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were, we think, the two most important people in the 20th century.
And that's part of the answer to the question, right? That you're saying you think he was the most important individual.
He was, because we live in a world today that was largely created by Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. The New Deal didn't just, fight the Depression. It created institutions that, tremendously changed the way we lived, starting with Social Security in 1935. And that's how we came to be such huge FDR fans. It was Social Security. When George Bush announced his pernicious plan to reform Social Security, which was really designed to destroy it in 2005 after his re-election, Stefan and I decided to do something about it. Stefan has a personal story about Social Security and how it affected his life, and he'll tell you that. But from that, we we started working with the FDR Library
in Hyde Park. Right?
In Hyde Park,
Right.
New York. It's a great place. Everybody should go there. It's only an hour north of Westchester,
Right.
and it was completely renovated and rebuilt last year.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
They gutted the entire building. It was designed by FDR himself. So in 2012, we started self-publishing calendars called Driving with FDR. The point to the title is that even though he was paralyzed by polio when he was 39 years old and could not walk, FDR could drive using hand controls that he designed. And it's an amazing story because not only does it show his ingenuity, but it also changed history, because we think that if Roosevelt hadn't been able to drive, he wouldn't have gone back into politics. He spent 7 years. He was paralyzed by polio on August 10th, 1921. From 1921 to 1928, he spent those 7 years learning how to make it look as if he could walk. And he was able to do that wearing cumbersome metal leg braces, and he would lean on a cane and grab onto someone's arm, because he couldn't get back into politics unless he could persuade people that he could walk. And he really couldn't walk. He couldn't walk unassisted, but he was able to make it look as if he could walk. That's why he was the best actor in the country.
I was going to say, yeah, which I know when you and Stefan mentioned that to me, it really sort of was a revelation. It opened, I'm well aware of FDR and his legacy, and I like to act myself. And so I said, wow, I never looked at it that way. But as we were talking about, it's hard to imagine in today's media-saturated society, as you were telling me, and I had heard this before, that the general populace didn't even know that he had polio, right? Is that true? Or?
No, people knew he had polio.
But they didn't know how crippled he was. Right, how crippled he actually was.
Yes.
It's the difference between being crippled and being lame.
Right. And by the way, we use the word cripple. We know it's not politically correct today.
Disabled.
That was the word that was
used at the time.
At the time.
Well, language changes.
Yes.
What's acceptable changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in 2012, we started self-publishing a calendar called Driving with FDR, and we did that for 3 years, 2012, 2013, and 2014. And the calendars featured these amazing pictures of the Roosevelts, mostly in cars, a lot of pictures of FDR driving his own car with these hand controls that he designed. That's the most amazing story. He was a lawyer, not an engineer, yet, and nothing existed. In 1926, he sketched out a device, and they took it to a blacksmith in Warm Springs, Georgia, where Roosevelt founded a polio clinic. Warm Springs changed world history because it's a unique place. The springs are, it's the only place in the United States that has a spring that the temperature is 88 degrees and extremely high in mineral.
Constantly.
Yes.
Constantly 88 degrees.
Comes out of the ground at 88 degrees.
Yeah, we were down in Warm Springs, and because of the mineral content of the water, it's naturally buoyant.
Right,
So
right.
paralyzed polio patients, including FDR, who could not walk at all on land, they get in the pool and they're able to walk.
Wow.
And not only does it give them hope and inspiration, but the aquatic exercise coupled with well-fitting braces, and they did revolutionary things in the brace making shop at Warm Springs at the polio clinic that Roosevelt founded. It enabled some paralyzed polio patients, including FDR, to make it appear as if they could walk. And that was critical. He couldn't get back into politics without it. But it also changed his personality. It taught him to be much more empathetic. And Eleanor Roosevelt famously wrote that polio gave Franklin a courage and a discipline that he had not had before.
Right. And by the way, we want to start to show, Richard, the photos from the calendar. If you could just start with the first one, and as we see them, then MH can describe what we're seeing.
Yeah, we're turning this into a book. We didn't do a 2015 calendar.
Yeah, here's the first one. Yeah.
We're working on a book called Driving with FDR. This first picture is of FDR in 1933 in his Plymouth with hand controls that he designed, and it was taken in front of the cottage that he designed in Warm Springs. Warm Springs became the most important polio rehabilitation and research center in the United States. And in fact, Franklin Roosevelt is the only president who can ever be credited with actually curing a disease, because the fundraising that was done, the March of Dimes was founded by Franklin Roosevelt in 1938, and they put a lot of money into research, and it led to the development of the polio vaccine in 1954, and that's why Franklin Roosevelt's image is on the dime.
I wanted to make sure everybody knew that, which I never knew before you told me, that's why he's on the dime. Here's another one image.
Now, this is in 1939. Roosevelt is in Warm Springs, and you can see his vanity license plate. It says FDR1. Franklin Roosevelt had the first known vanity license plates. They were gifts from the governors of Georgia because they wanted him to visit. And what he's doing in this picture is he's holding an impromptu news conference with the reporters who followed him every time. He went to Warm Springs 41 times from 1924 until he died there on April 12th, 1945. It was where he remade his life and reinvented himself. If he had never found Warm Springs, then he would never have gone back into politics, and the New Deal reforms, including Social Security, which affects everyone in the most positive way. I mean, Social Security was designed by Roosevelt really to be a self-help program, because it's called a payroll tax, the Social Security fee, which is the FICA, on your.
It's actually an insurance that we all pay into.
Right.
And it's insurance. It's not charity. It's insurance.
Right.
We pay
isn't that
for
what
it.
FICA stands for? Federal Insurance.
Insurance Contribution
Act. Yeah.
Act, yeah.
Well, Stefan.
Right.
Stefan's life was dramatically affected by Social Security.
My father passed away when I was 8 years old, leaving my mother a widow with 6 sons to raise.
Wow.
The eldest was 16. The youngest was 3.
Right.
If it weren't for the Social Security survivor benefits,
Right.
she would never have been able to keep us under the same roof.
Wow.
We would have been spread out amongst relatives,
Wow.
and today, I wouldn't know my brothers. So
Yeah,
Social
yeah.
Security is very, very important to me.
So sort of responsible for the life you've had.
and,
right?
and a lot of people don't understand that it's not just retirement.
Right.
It's survivor benefits. It's 3-year-olds.
Right.
Right. People don't understand that, and this is why it was so important. And when George Bush wanted to dismantle Social Security, I got very upset.
Yeah, I can
Very
imagine.
upset.
Yeah, right.
So in 2005, we organized a not-for-profit corporation that we called the Preserve Social Security and Medicare Coalition. And we started working on it, and we made contacts at the FDR Library, and one thing led to another, and we've become FDR experts, and we are now turning Driving with FDR into a book, and it's going to focus on the importance of driving to FDR. Our website is drivingwithfdr.com, and you can see these great pictures on our website.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of great photos on the website. I'm looking at it right now, in fact. Yeah, and there's a new span that's being built here across the Hudson, and I know you have some thoughts about how that in its own way could also honor FDR.
Well, yeah, we renamed our not-for-profit corporation the For a Better Westchester and NYS Association, because nothing's going to happen with Social Security. Social Security is financially secure until at least 2033. And ironically, that's thanks to Ronald Reagan, because in 1983, when Social Security was literally on the verge of bankruptcy, Reagan passed the most recent major reform of Social Security, and that he raised taxes. That's what he did. He raised the payroll taxes and increased the number of employees who were involved, and did some other things, but it wound up generating a huge surplus. Social Security today holds about 16% of the national debt, because each year its surpluses are taken by the federal government, and in exchange, Social Security is given non-negotiable Treasury bonds. So Social Security is probably the largest single holder of United States Treasury bonds in the world. But this was Roosevelt's greatest accomplishment. It was the New Deal legislation he was proudest of, and instrumental in this was Frances Perkins, who was Roosevelt's close friend, and she was the first female cabinet member. She was the labor secretary, and she and Roosevelt together devised Social Security to be a self-supporting program.
Right.
That would provide pensions, and later it was expanded to include survivor benefits and disability benefits. And it was the most important accomplishment of the New Deal. Now, we also think that the notion, the concepts underlying Social Security, that basically it's self-financing. Employees contribute 6.2% of their pay, and employers contribute 6.2%. It does not come from any general taxes, and its revenues go to dedicated trust funds. This arose from the spirit of Warm Springs, as it was called, because that's how they did financial aid in Warm Springs. Everyone had to contribute something to the extent that they could.
What they could.
Yeah. No, well, what about, I was going in a different direction, but I'm glad that you were able to expand on that. But
The bridge.
yes,
So-
exactly.
So we think,
We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, I guess.
yes, we'll cross that bridge right now. We think that the new Tappan Zee Bridge should be renamed the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Tappan Zee Bridge, and we're starting a campaign to accomplish exactly that. They were the two most important people of the 20th century. There are very
Definitely
few.
of the Hudson Valley.
Yes, they were Hudson Valley natives. They were FDR was born and raised in Hyde Park in Dutchess County, and Eleanor spent her adult life pretty much up there when she wasn't in Washington or in Manhattan. She has her own cottage up in Hyde Park that was separate from FDR. She needed her own place to get away. It's a fascinating place, and everyone should visit it. But we think it would be appropriate to rename the Tappan Zee Bridge the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Tappan Zee Bridge. It would encourage tourism. It would recognize the contributions of the Roosevelts to fighting the Depression and winning the war. We would not have won the war without Franklin Roosevelt. And what he did, he saw the dangers posed by Hitler before virtually anyone else, in part because he was fluent in German. And he had tremendous opposition to rearming America. This country was tremendously isolationist until the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Yes.
Without the Roosevelts, we wouldn't have the modern institutions that we have today, Social Security, the labor laws, the securities laws that basically require that issuers and sellers of securities be honest, that they don't lie.
Right.
This is all due to Roosevelt, and it all arose in sort of the spirit of Warm Springs, the idea that people working together, a communitarian approach, that people can work together for the benefit of all. And that's what Roosevelt did. That's how he led. And the other thing is that there's virtually nothing that's named for Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Well, what I was going to say, you do have the drive on the west side of Manhattan that's named for him, and the island, Roosevelt Island, right?
Yes, and there's Four Freedoms Park
Right.
on Roosevelt Island. There are a lot of things named after FDR. There are a few things named after Eleanor Roosevelt. But other than a destroyer in the Navy, I don't think there's anything that,
Named
of
after
a
both of
meaningful
them?
significance that's named after both of them. That's why we propose that the new bridge be renamed the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Bridge. The Mid-Hudson Bridge, which is in Poughkeepsie, is named after FDR, but this would be after both of them.
Of course, I was going to say another, not to torture the metaphor, but another long, steep bridge you have to cross, seriously, is that the current governor of the state of New York has a filial devotion to naming it for his father. It hasn't that come up? I don't know if it's literally Governor Andrew Cuomo who proposed it, but that some people have said, what about naming it for Mario Cuomo? Have you heard that?
No, that's the first I've
Oh,
heard
yeah,
of
no, I
it.
did hear that. I think it was right after Mario Cuomo passed away recently that came out of somewhere, and some people thought it came understandably from his son. So, there's that other aspect. Of course, if you follow the economic trend in performance venues and sports venues and naming rights, how they sell naming rights to corporations, I'm wondering if it's going to be called the Google Bridge or something like that. Google they have a little bit of money there, I think. So, but getting back to FDR, I know you've also talked about his influence, again, ending World War II and with Hitler, right, and the Holocaust in general, and what impact he had on that.
Well, there are a lot of older Jewish Americans who lived through the FDR years, and are very bitter.
They're the only president to serve 4 terms, right?
Well,
And that's why they can only serve 2 is because of him.
that was the Republican revenge. They enacted a constitutional amendment, limiting the president to 2 terms. We're against. That's another thing that the For a Better Westchester and NYS Association is against. We're against term limits.
Oh,
The only
really?
term limit should be an election.
But even but there are a lot of politicians who are for term limits. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I hope I'm not misspeaking, Westchester County Executive Rob Astorino.
Yeah, when he
I
ran
believe
for
he's
governor,
is he for term limits?
when
I
he
believe
ran,
he is. Yeah.
when he ran for governor, he said that all statewide elected officials should have
term limit.
8-year term limits.
Right.
But he didn't sign.
Statewide, not necessarily county level.
Well, when the county legislature passed term limits in 2010, Astorino didn't sign the bill. He let it become law without his signature. But here's our point. Term limits cause more problems than they solve, because what happens is that you wind up getting tremendous uncertainty. And look, think about your own life. If you're going to go into something, take a job that's a tough job to get, and getting yourself elected is, there are always a lot of issues.
Yep.
Then you're less likely to do that if you're limited to a short period of time. It's not just that, it's experience. You need to learn it takes time to learn how things work. It takes years. Particularly something as complicated as being a legislator or,
Right.
an elected official.
And if someone is doing a good job, why do I want to take that job away from them? Just
you're not
because they've been doing it for
you mean
a
with
long
the term
time.
limit? You're saying with the term limits, yeah.
If he's doing a good job, I want to keep electing him
Right.
or her.
Well, listen, as you know, there have been federal legislators, served for 50 years, in Congress, I'm saying.
Well, the problem.
I think Strom Thurmond was one of them, in fact. Remember, he...
The problem is that because of gerrymandering and because of the way we finance our campaigns through private contributions, there's very little turnover in most legislatures. In the New York State Legislature, it's the same people pretty much year after year. It's a tiny fraction who actually lose their seats in an election. And the ones who do usually lose it in a primary.
Right. But isn't it, if I'm not mistaken, a Jeffersonian concept of citizen legislators where people, who, of course, in those days, let's say maybe they were farmers and they would go and serve, but then after a limited amount of time serving, would go back to the farm or whatever their profession was.
Well,
they were citizens first and legislators second.
Jefferson was wrong about a lot of things. He was right about a lot of things, but he was wrong about a lot of things, and he certainly changed his mind when it was convenient. He in philosophy, he did not support what became the Louisiana Purchase, because he believed in limited government, but he saw it was a great deal. He changed his mind, and it's not just that. Things are a lot more complicated now than they were in Jefferson's time.
Right.
So, I mean, if you want to have better elected officials, then what we need is a change in the way districts are gerrymandered. You need nonpartisan redistricting, and you need to change the way we do campaign finance.
Right, and as long as we're on that topic, what do you feel about that instead of candidates being selected in some cases by a very insular group of insiders of the political party, that the primaries be held to select candidates within a party? Now, some politicians feel that way too. I know Assemblyman Steve Katz, who I know well. He believes that that people should vote in a primary to decide that party's candidate instead of having some small group of people, with whatever self-interest they have, choosing candidates.
Well, New York has unique election laws. There is more, I'm a lawyer, and there is more election law litigation in New York than in any other state. There may be more in New York than in all the other states combined. And the reason for that is because the election laws are designed to make it difficult to get onto the ballot. They're very, very, very technical, and they're designed to keep the insiders in power. So
right, and that's why some people who are more populist saying every candidate, not just when an incumbent's being challenged, for example, or when somebody wants to challenge the party designee, but every candidate should get that designation through a primary.
Well,
so, basically you're adding a whole level of elections.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, that's all true. But look, Roosevelt was a brilliant electoral strategist.
Mm-hmm.
He was the first modern politician. He understood the power of communications more than anybody else. He understood, and that was most evident.
He understood how to use the press,
Right. I was
which
going to
was
say
very important.
And by the way, with the couple of minutes we have left, we should just touch on that aspect of FDR too, his fireside chats, and how today there's this term destination viewing. His chats were destination listening, right?
Correct. My mother was young during Roosevelt's tenure, and she had remembered when Roosevelt was giving a fireside chat, you were in front of that radio. And if you didn't own a radio, you walked to someone's house who had a radio.
Wow.
And you sat in front of it. Does anyone do? I can't remember the last time I actually sat and watched the president on
Right.
television.
Well, and we've all seen those photos, to your point, Stefan, of people like looking at the radio,
Yes,
as if they were
watching
watching
the radio.
a TV that didn't exist at that time, but they were almost watching the radio, listening to it. And the other quick point, and then we do have to wrap it up, is you were saying that it was not uncommon during FDR's term in office that people would have pictures of him on the wall, which I don't think you see too much anymore for any modern, any current president or recent presidents.
My mother told me they had a picture of FDR on the wall over the radio.
Right.
And you would sit there and stare at his face and listen to his voice.
He only gave 31 fireside chats in his 12 years as president. That's fewer than 3 a year.
Right. Yeah.
And he spoke conversationally. He did things. He explained things to people in a way that had never been done before.
Right. Well, we're going. As we said, I'm going to have both of you back definitely for one or more shows because there's so much we could talk about, including as you've talked about, MH, the connection between FDR and Ronald Reagan, who was an admirer, a great admirer of FDR.
Reagan loved FDR.
Right.
He modeled his career and his speaking style after FDR. And Reagan is the father of California vanity plates. As governor, he signed them into law. And the law that Reagan signed provides that in California, the vanity plate fees go for environmental projects statewide. It's Ronald Reagan's greatest unknown accomplishment.
Great. All right. And I want to thank my guests, M.H. Freiberg and Stefan Lantz of Driving with FDR. And you can go to drivingwithfdr.com to find out more about it. And thank you for watching Frank Talks with Bruce DeBlog. And remember, when Bruce DeBlog listens, people talk. Thank you.